Welcome to the Inside Track from Barndoor Strategy for insight and analysis on British politics. Hello, and today we'll be discussing think tanks, and I'm joined by Havard Hughes, the founder and CEO of Barndoor Strategy.
It's great to look at this topic. Think tanks are vitally important in terms of the policy-making process, but they are sometimes poorly understood by those who are outside the public affairs world.
So let's just back up and start off with what is a think tank?
Well, what isn't a think tank? I mean, essentially a think tank is a group of people that puts out publications and papers on a particular policy issue. And some can be incredibly influential, some can set the entire tone of a debate, some can foreshadow what a government's going to do in office, and some of them stream into the wilderness for decades, and perhaps their policy papers then get picked up by subsequent generations of policymakers.
So sometimes there's a sort of think tank capacity from an industry body, and sometimes it's purely an institution.
Well, it depends. I mean, there are organisations out there that have been set up to pursue a particular political mission, and maybe that's free market economics or free market politics, and there are a number of think tanks that are based on that basis. Others, there are think tanks that look at the social agenda. They want to focus on driving, say, forward socialism, or other think tanks that are prioritised around democratic engagement, democratic issues, and how you can build that out in terms of the sort of multi-politic. But there's an inherent tension there in terms of, is this thing purely a sort of academic style think tank producing a sort of public policy output that is some sort of policy paper, or is it actually some sort of lobbying organisation?
It's maybe worth looking at how they've been developed over the last few decades, because, that there are some think tanks that are over a century old, but it's really only in the last sort of 40 or so years that they've exploded.
Well, yeah, and if you go back, say, to the beginnings of the Labour movement, you've got the Fabians, and arguably, are they a think tank? Well, yes, I think so. But you've got organisations like that have been really seminal in developing that body of debate and body of policy around, say, what a Labour government would do and what the Labour Party should do when it's in office. And then you've got similar organisations like the Centre for Policy Studies during the Thatcher era, when you have that massive reform of the way that the British state operated, and that think tank in particular was seminal in terms of the work it was producing and the direction of travel of the government. And sometimes you end up with a situation with think tanks that you've got a revolving door between the people in the think tank, particularly in times of opposition, and the people who are then brought in as special advisors and parts of the sort of ministerial team in terms of government.
And you have very different roots and pressures behind think tanks. On the one hand, you have something like the Fabian Society, which is a grassroots movement for a particular type of very centrist socialism, very liberal-minded socialism. There's really a wing of the Labour Party that grows in constituencies, and it comes out of discussions up and down the country. At the other end of the scale, you very much do have sort of industry bodies and lobbying groups and lobbying firms funding these things. You obviously have in the US a whole industry around think tanks on another scale.
You see, the US politics, the US is a big country, their politics is big, and their public affairs world is big. And so you have think tanks operate in a rather different way. But going back to sort of where we started, so there are some think tanks out there that are actually disguised lobbying operations, or not so much disguised, but by definition, they are a lobbying operation. That's their raison d'etre, and they might focus on a really narrow niche topic. And they may have adjuncts. They might run, say, an all-party group, or one of the informal groups that you have established in the Westminster Parliament, but works cross-party. And there are other similar types of groups, both in the Scottish Parliament and in the Senate. And you tend to get some bodies like that will work through that type of medium to achieve their policy goals. But then you get much bigger think tanks that operate in a fundamentally different way. You get the think tanks that do the massive Scots party conferences in terms of sort of 3 or 4 major fringe events. They'll block book fees at all the main party conferences and put out their portfolio. And it's quite interesting, actually, when you go to those, particularly as a public affairs person, because there's a very different tone sometimes at the conferences, but sometimes there isn't. And that can work in a very different way. And also, it's very interesting to see how the delegates at the conferences, who can be very different, react to, say, a think tank that perhaps comes from across the political sea and that's come, say, to Labour Party conference, or vice versa, and how they're perceived and how they try and address that audience, because there are very different sort of tones to the party conferences. Sometimes even think tanks, you'd think of very professional outfits who understand them intimately, get it slightly wrong.
Yeah, I've certainly been to some gatherings which have a very contractual obligation feel of, we're known as a left-wing or a right-wing outfit, and this is not our usual conference, but we have to do all three of them, and I'm afraid we're here whether you like it or not.
Yeah.
But also there's some political pressure for some of them, because I think a big factor in the explosion in the 70s and 80s of think tanks was politicians wanting some options which weren't from the civil service and weren't from their party, and they wanted something different. And that can work well if the politicians feel that they have a certain amount of control over it. Where it gets a little bit more fraught as a relationship is when the suspicion is that somebody else is funding that and is perhaps pressuring the outputs.
That's right. That there is an element there whereby it can be difficult to get the policy formulation you want in the civil service for various different reasons. And we've touched upon this in other conversations that we've had. The civil service tend to be very generalist. They don't have that sort of specialist knowledge, whereas, of course, a think tank can get an absolute specialist in them. Some of them have had leading academics working and writing policy papers about exactly how they think some aspect of government policy or the activity of the state should function. And that can be a very powerful tool for politicians to then say, well, here is this proposal from the think tank. It's almost like a white paper. And you've got something then you can build a campaign around, you can go to an election around, and you can use that as the basis of party policy. And that's a very powerful tool if you're trying to change a sort of perceived consensus on a particular topic and drive policy change. So that's certainly sort of one really powerful way that think tanks work in the UK scenario.
So what are the outputs of think tanks? I mean, what do they produce if we think of them as a factory?
Well, meetings. There's a lot of think tanks that put on meetings, and sometimes, are these meetings for the sake of meetings? So large parts of a conference fringe program, if you are a doyen of party conferences, are essentially events organized by think tanks. And they tend to be, sometimes get entire sort of themed areas of the party conference around a particular set of policy issues. Or with the Conservatives in recent years, you've almost had an alternative conference, but who have the sort of Edinburgh Fringe for right-wing thinking. And these are sort of run by think tanks, coordinated by think tanks. It tends to be sort of well curated. They have a real sense of mission about what they're doing, and it can be really helpful for politicians and delegates to sort of work out, what are the key issues in a particular policy area. But then if there's the other side of it, which is essentially it can often feel like a bit of a sausage factory. We've been commissioned to do a paper on housing. We're going to give you a paper on housing, whether you like it or not.
Well, talking on papers, I mean, it's worth looking at the research because it spans a huge spread, and at the one end of the scale, there's a lot of it that's quite poor, it has to be said. There are quite a lot of, flimsy two sides of A4 with heavy assertions and maybe one footnote, if that. At the other end of the spectrum, you have something that stands up against the very best academic research. And ironically, of course, the flimsy two sides of paper might actually have quite a bit of political traction. And the very learned, well-researched document that understands the policy area may never be read by anyone.
Well, such is the nature of politics. And sometimes what politicians are looking for is that two-sider that might be written in layman's language and be relatively simple to introduce.
I'm suggesting that some politicians might be quite simple people.
I think they understand the need to message the voting public. And if you've got a long and complex policy document that talks in abstruse language about very complex issues, it's very difficult to get that to the public in a way that's going to make them understand it. Therefore, it's difficult to win votes on it. And that can be problematic.
And that feeds into how think tanks are different from universities, because they do have a sort of public affairs and comms aspect to it. They do press release things. Although universities have press releases and so forth, it's never on the same sort of scale.
Oh, I mean, it can be absolutely explicit. I mean, some think tanks are structured exactly like a business, and it's quite mechanical. They've got a fundraising arm that essentially will try and get people to sponsor events. They've got policy teams working on particular policy areas. Again, they can be funded by external sponsors or potentially out of the general funding that's coming in. They have a range of outputs, from press releases to pamphlets to fringe meetings to, alternatively, meetings at Westminster.
And the change in working practices is very striking. If you go back 60 or 70 years ago, your standard thing on any difficult policy area was, we'll put together a committee of academics from the universities who specialize in this. No one does that anymore. Instead, you either do a civil service route or else you go outside of the civil service, typically to one or more think tank.
That's right, and part of that's the velocity of the policy process, which is certainly sped up to some extent, although not necessarily with the resultant velocity of the outcomes. But it's often easier for politicians to reach for a friendly think tank than necessarily get a set of academics to do something.
Do you have a sense as to the quality of the research in these things and how that relates to how well or badly they're regarded?
It's extremely variable, and it doesn't seem to have any hard and fast correlation to how well they're regarded. I think really the key thing from the public affairs point of view is how closely is that think tank aligned with the present government? Because a think tank can often be that sort of canary in the coal mine in terms of, what is the government going to do next? And there's been certainly a lot of interest on, say, energy policy at the moment in works that the Tony Blair Institute have put together, simply because some of the people who were at the Tony Blair Institute are now in government, and they wrote long and detailed things when they were at the Tony Blair Institute. And so people are looking to those documents as sources for what might be the future trajectory of government policy.
Well, indeed there, and also I think the IPPR also had a large number of staffers resign to take up posts in the government. And it does seem to be a very much trend in opposition that every think tank tends to tout itself as we will supply the policymakers of the next government.
Yeah.
A lot of them, I have to say, end up being sorely disappointed.
Well, this is it. It's a bit that sort of West Wing effect, isn't it? I think a lot of people perhaps who work in the think tank sector see themselves, perhaps like many parliamentary researchers do, as some great head of office out of the sort of the West Wing, that great television program from the 2000s, and as some of a significant future player in politics, when in actuality they're scribbling away on some paper that no one's ever going to read, but somebody may have paid handsomely for.
To what extent does the whole process of think tanks rival or complement policymaking in things like, say, the civil service?
Well, it can be really instrumental into the direction of the civil service in terms of when you get a new government coming in, because if they have got things that have been said and worked on in outside government, then those can be brought into government as tools for the civil service then to build their policy around, and tools to, say, shape a white paper, for example, if there's a big complex piece of legislation. So that would be a sort of a prime example. But also sometimes they can be used as tools to sort of rebut perhaps something which might be in vogue in the civil service or being pushed by the previous administration. So they can have multiple uses.
Yeah, and I could certainly think in terms of two obvious dimensions. One is on briefing an incoming minister, where it's a case of we haven't had anyone with this political agenda in some time, and the starting point has been to look at things in opposition.
And there's another example as well. How do MPs get briefing information? Well, obviously, public affairs companies send them briefing information. Members of the public write them letters. Their constituents don't necessarily read them. They don't necessarily read them. The constituents also write to them as well, and they can find that very influential. But also, there's the House of Commons Library. And where does the House of Commons Library? If you go to the House of Commons website, look in the library research papers which are publicly available, and look where they're getting their information from, they'll often then source information from think tanks, because they may not be authoritative primary resources, but they're very convenient secondary resources who write complex things in a language members of Parliament can understand.
Yeah, a lot of this is very often placed as what's called grey research. It's not quite peer-reviewed academic research, but it's not just a blog piece either.
Exactly. And the problem with peer-reviewed academic research, although it's impeccable and of an international standard, it's not very easy for people who aren't in that academic route to actually deal with, to investigate, to interrogate. Whereas this stuff, written by think tanks, perhaps the two-pager, that might be something which MPs can really understand in a more fundamental and granular way.
The other challenges, and I say this coming from an academic background, are that not only does it take forever for something to get through a peer review, whereas you might want to just do a short, sharp policy paper to get to the point that can be published within a couple of weeks rather than 2 years. And even then, it's not guaranteed that it will actually be right. So the peer review process can be absolutely robust, but you can still have something that's heavily contested at the end of it.
That's right.
Say, well, we're not.
Absolutely. And there's also the velocity of public policy as well, because sometimes a crisis or an evolving risk will necessitate some sort of public policy development, which may not have been previously conceived of by the civil service or indeed anybody else in the public sphere. Although that is unlikely, there will be someone who's foreseen this. And so therefore, that organisation may well be a think tank, in which case people will reach for that as their starting point at the very least.
But a cynic could argue that it's also an insidious way of avoiding the party's mechanisms, avoiding the sort of democratic.
Well, this is an interesting debate, particularly for those who come from the more democratic parties in terms of their policy-making process. And both the Liberal Democrats and Labour have internal and very democratic means of party policy development. And in theory, party policy in both those political parties is determined essentially by the delegate on the floor of the conference. In actuality, how much of that ever makes its way sort of from the cutting room floor of government?
Well, in fact, I mean, there are locked in as Labour Party policy, and then they weren't in the manifesto.
That's right. So. And certainly the Conservative Party has taken a much more pragmatic approach in that there are policy discussions internally and there are policy forums and various different bodies. But fundamentally, the manifesto is within the pen of the manifesto writer. And, as we've seen in recent years of general elections, that may not necessarily be, quite in alignment with what has been perceived as the trend of even that government or the prime minister seeking re-election. I could refer perhaps to a certain notorious manifesto in the 2017 election, where all sorts of proposals were trailed, which proved to be extremely controversial. And that is obviously a risk with that process. And now, again, that's where think tanks come into their own, because a think tank's already done this, and already there's been a big focus on it and a big public debate on it. It's much less controversial if a political party then, say, adopts that at manifesto level.
And the mandate theory of government that we have, if it's in the manifesto, we've got a mandate to deliver it with minimal amendment.
And the Salisbury Convention, indeed, which underlies that.
All of that collectively doesn't actually necessarily commit the parties themselves being democratic. And there are quite a few parties in the UK which aren't remotely.
And we do seem to be heading into a new world where coalition government is again much more likely in the UK, notwithstanding our electoral system. And of course, as we've seen recently in the 2010 government, you can have things written in stone in the manifesto and they still don't necessarily make it into legislation. In fact, you've seen things that were written in stone in the manifesto be completely reversed when it came to legislation, and obviously with major consequences for the party which have that in its manifesto.
Do you think there's something to be said for the view that think tanks as a sort of sector have shared priorities and shared pressures, or do you think it's a bit wider?
They clearly do. I mean, anybody who's trying to write policy is going to have a set of shared pressures and priorities. I mean, thirdly, how do you fund it? Who's going to do the writing? Where do you find the talented policy academics and others to basically put together these papers? And those are the shared challenges. And there's a certain pack mentality in terms of if you've got an incoming government and there'll be a group of think tanks working with that, and they will tend to work in synergy and together with each other. And you will then get sort of more of a sort of debate coming across the field from think tanks who oppose that. So there is that sort of dynamic to it, but it's the think tanks can be very different. And by definition, they're not all fishing in the same pond because they've got different funders, they're seeking different outcomes, and they operate in a very different way.
Can we maybe look at some of those differences? I mean, how, particularly around ideological differences, I do get the sense that there's a very different culture amongst Labour-leaning think tanks to Conservative.
Oh, very much so, very much so. I mean, certainly also because a lot of Conservative-leaning think tanks have been really fixated on the development of the 1980s and on the free market and the sort of the Adam Smith Institute, and that's a real focus on free market politics has really dominated Conservative thinking for a generation, really the last 30 or 40 years or more, going back to Keith Joseph. Whereas Labour think tanks tend to perhaps have a broader reach in terms of public policy, and certainly because of the way the Labour Party tends to have a much more open debate about policy within its ranks, which tends to be quite on the left, then there's also a very important role for more centrist think tanks in terms of actually what might Labour do in government when it needs to perhaps have that more majoritarian support of the country as a whole.
But they both do seem to take a very philosophical approach underpinning this, which is what is a Labour approach or a Conservative
approach? What is a socialist approach? And that sort of underlying philosophy is very important in the Labour movement, and you don't tend to necessarily get that to the same extent in the Conservative Party because of the way the Conservative coalition works. It's a different coalition from the Labour coalition.
And then there are the more independent, non-partisan think tanks. I mean, I think all think tanks to some extent say that they're non-partisans, that they're sometimes philosophical.
They would say that, wouldn't it?
Well, I'm thinking of something like, say, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, which I would say it has traditionally been considered the sort of gold standard for independence. Actually, most of the last government spent its time attacking them for being hopelessly partisan and biased against them. And now the current government has a fair number of criticisms about them. But generally, they are highly esteemed by journalists as producing some fairly independent
ultimately, if you're being criticised by both sides of the debate, then probably you are being reasonably fair. But it's a very difficult thing to be fair because when you're in an evolving political debate, the future trajectory policy is not always clear, and therefore the recommendations may not always be correct.
Well, the IFS, I think, has carved out a niche for itself because it has a much more technocratic approach. It doesn't have a sort of philosophy, as it were, other than maybe the recurring question of the sums need to add up, and we are skeptical.
Which, I mean, using the power of numbers is a real sort of leveler, because fundamentally, do the sums add up? Can the government essentially borrow the money it needs to drive public spending, because that's how the British state has been run for a generation? Can they get the money from the markets to basically refinance the government's loans? And so fundamentally there is that solubility question, is this actually a sensible idea? And of course you saw that with the whole situation with the Liz Truss government and its budget, in that the markets took a cynical view. Now maybe if there'd been more of the think tank-led approach there, and all this had been explained in detailed papers, that could have been better priced in. But you had a government there which was essentially looking to spend an awful lot of money, plus also making a lot of changes that reduce the amount of money raised, and that was something that the financial markets were very nervous about. And if you are a British government and you're needing to borrow money, you can't make the financial markets nervous.
But the counter-argument used about the Liz Truss government is that there was no reliance on think tanks to the exclusion of other things. So this was, we won't listen to our civil servants because the IEA has come out with these figures, and this is what we want to hear.
Yeah, but yes, that's true to some extent. I don't think it was the IEA were the ones arguing for the massively increased spending on people's personal energy, and it was that huge public spending commitment, which was, very generous of the government in trying to help people out in a time of crisis. That's what fundamentally caused the huge problems in the markets, because
it was also a matter of what was politically possible at the time.
Well,
across Europe.
But if you look at the way that the UK government debt is priced, the people on the financial markets were looking at that saying, well, if you're making that sort of massive government commitment, and of course once you had the rowback that started with the appointment, with the dismissal of Kwasi Kwarteng as Chancellor, you then had the situation whereby that spending didn't occur. And so that was really what undermined the trust budget in the eyes of the financial markets. Now, could that have been solved by a more rigorous approach in terms of leading that policy through think tanks, through the white paper process? It's very difficult because, of course, the nature of the whole arrival of the Truss government was so unusual, because I don't think there's really much of the precedent of the Prime Minister having to resign over a crisis, and even less of the precedent the Prime Minister of the day having to resign over a crisis to do with birthday cake. So that is the nature of political scandals. Often it's strangers to things that cause all sorts of unexpected consequences and precipitate senior resignations. So it's a very difficult one to sort of foreshadow, but I think definitely if there had been more think tank work in this area that gave the markets reassurance that what the Truss government was doing was financially sensible, then I think there would have been less of a financial market reaction to the budget when it came out. And if you recall, part of the problem was the speed of which Truss wished to move. And that which made people even more nervous.
Yes, even her advisor,
or even her chancellor, even her chancellor said, "Hang up." So I think yes, it's a very good example of when you can have a situation whereby, because you haven't forewarned about the direction of travel, you cause much more uncertainty. And if you look at the recent policies of this current administration, certainly the way that the taxation policies in terms of, say, farmers have gone, they've led to multiple protests in London by tractors and farmers in general. None of that was forewarned of in the in terms of Labour's prior thinking prior to government. In fact, they contraindicated. They said they definitely wouldn't do it, and that's often what makes things so controversial. Because if you tell people what you're going to do and then do it, people can't really complain that they weren't told. But once you've got that situation whereby you spring something on them and it comes as a surprise, and it's a bit of an issue. Now, you will well know that, of course, in this area, there has been quite a bit of think tank work, and it's become quite controversial as to sort of the nature of that work and what the outcomes were, and the trajectory from which these policies may or may not have come. And so, but of course, that's been far from helpful in terms of the government delivering its narrative and managing the media over its policy.
Do think tanks coordinate much?
They can do, yeah, and certainly you see that with groups of think tanks working, say, so. In terms of Labour Party policy or Conservative Party policy, there's definite coordination. There's definite coordination at conference, and you get whole sort of themes of debate on particular hot topics, and every think tank worth its salt wants to have a debate on a particular, say, housing is a great example. And, if you're interested in housing policy, the last few rounds of party conferences have been fantastic for you because you've had every single sort of housing fringe you could possibly imagine.
So we're talking about joint publications, joint events.
Well, joint publication, joint events, or even similar publications and similar events.
Yeah.
And you've had, is it group
or breakfast meetings?
That's right. Yeah, yeah.
Like that,
The whole sort of stage of breakfast meetings, conventional sort of like discussion groups.
Is there a danger of taking that to the extent of having groupthink? Because surely the point of think tanks originally was to get outside of the mainstream repeated answers and have something different. And is there a danger of an echo chamber if there's too much?
Very much so. And that is a problem. And that's why it's good to have a good and diverse range of think tanks. But inevitably, you do tend to get some views and concepts dominating the public policy debate. It's just, unfortunately, it's inevitable.
And how independent are they? I mean, there are frequently questions about funding. There are frequent questions about, what the fundamental motives of individual think tanks are.
Well, it's difficult, isn't it? Because fundamentally, he who pays the piper calls the tune. But you can't get senior and serious academics to work on things if they don't have funding. So there is a question of fact and degree, and it goes back to sort of perceptions of such the institutions as the Institute of Fiscal Studies. They have to get their funding from somewhere, and that does potentially have an influence on what their outcomes are. But some organisations like the IFS have done a very good job of seeming to the majority of perhaps the people in politics to be more distant perhaps from their funding source, etc., and be more balanced in terms of their outcomes, and perhaps some think tanks that are perceived as indeed much more partisan.
And certainly that's linked also, I think, to disclosures and transparency of individual think tanks, because some are very opaque about their source of funding, some are a little bit more,
and that's becoming
some are very, very transparent.
Exactly, and that's becoming increasingly controversial. I think the era of the sort of like, we can't tell you who funds us, it's starting to cause all sorts of hairs to run, because it makes people fundamentally suspicious. Well, who is funding you? Because we do live in a much more dangerous world, and we do have the rise of the dictatorships. And the question mark is, well, is this money coming from, say, one of those dictatorial regimes? Where is it coming from? Is it coming from an organisation that fundamentally doesn't have the UK or the UK public's best interests at heart, for example? And that's a debate that resonates both on the left and the right.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much, Havard, and join us next time on The Inside Track.
Thank you.